Okay, so hello. Um, this one's going to be a little interesting because I'm trying to record it after my baby has gone to sleep and she's just on the other side of the wall that I'm recording this behind. So, excuse me if the sound is a little weird, but we're going to do our best. And I really wanted to get this out tonight so that you could have a look at it prior to the assignment being due on Wednesday. And you'll see some stuff on quantum physics, our next big subject, showing up very soon, hopefully tomorrow morning. Anyway, I wanted to wind up our discussion of climate change by just just looking at the overview. And the effects of climate change are something that I asked you to do a lot of reading on. They are many and they are varied. And the basic idea here is given by this plot that I borrowed from the IPCC and International Panel on Climate Change, it's a UN body. And this is a composite of a number of different bits of information, but basically shows the run-up in temperature from sort of pre-industrial reference period, so back in sort of the 1850 to 1900 area, so you can see that here, okay? And the run-up in temperature. So with current data, we are somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1 degree Celsius above that baseline. And the projections are for that to continue in an upward trend. And that's only in the near term. They have projections out farther, and of course the band here, if you look at my pointer, is showing just the error in modeling this kind of thing. Because as precise as a lot of the science is, and the amount of effort that goes into all of these predictions, there's still a lot of things that we know but don't know with great certainty in terms of factors that affect the climate. So that's the overall picture. The global average temperature is going up. It's worth saying that the global average temperature really doesn't tell the whole story. So you can ignore the codings here. If you went and read the IPCC report, you could see sort of what they're talking about with all this kind of stuff. They try to look at distinct climatic regions on the Earth. But what I wanted to show is that the average global temperature is going up by this amount, and 1 degree Celsius doesn't sound like that much, and yet if you think about certain regions on the Earth, so up here at higher latitudes, so around the Arctic and the northern parts of the United States and Canada and Russia and places like that, the amount of change is actually really very large. And the amount of change over oceans, which are these huge sinks of thermal energy, water has a very high heat capacity, so it soaks up a lot of that warming, relatively little. Okay? Now, it's not to say there's no effects at lower latitudes, but it does show you how, even with a relatively moderate increase in the global average temperature, you can get intense effects over certain regions. And these effects are, all the predictions say, are going to be amplified over the coming decades. Now, in terms of the specific effects, all kinds of things. Raising temperatures in certain regions are going to stress various species, both plant and animal, and that could cause extinctions, which could have knock-on effects in various ecosystems. You have all of the ice melting, so a nice picture here from NASA, taken from the same perspective, the Muir Glacier in Alaska, 1941 on the left, and 2004 on the right. And not only has it receded many kilometers up the valley here, but the thickness of the remaining glacier up there is much, much, much smaller than it was a mere 60 years ago. Well, about 80 years ago, but the picture is very much the same now in 2020. That, of course, all of that ice melting and going into the oceans has other effects, right? Sea level rise, we start talking about, all the ice over Greenland going into the oceans and raising the sea level, the thermal expansion of the existing liquid water in the oceans, raising sea level over the next decades and bringing a lot of profound effects to coastal communities and island nations in particular. And then things like the intensification of hurricanes. And this one is more difficult to put a finger on, but generally most of climate studies confirm that hurricane intensity and hurricane frequency on average is on an upward swing and is largely because of the effects of climate change, which we are causing with our emissions of greenhouse gases. So, all that said about the effects of climate change and sort of where we're going from now as the Earth warms and warms and warms, as we put more and more greenhouse gases, we trap more and more solar energy here on the surface of the Earth, which then again raises the temperature of the Earth and can have these sort of feedback loops that we've talked about where, for example, when the Arctic ice cap goes away, which is predicted to do in relatively short order, in fact, then we have the problem that now the albedo of that portion of ocean is now much lower than it was before, right? It's just open water for large portions of the year, and that open water has a very low albedo. That means more energy is going to stay, more solar energy will stay here on the surface of the Earth and further drive the increase in global temperatures. So, what do? Well, obviously, the most obvious way, and the most technologically achievable way at this point, is to look at how to limit the emissions of greenhouse gases that we as humankind put into the atmosphere. Okay? And we can, this is a great graph actually here on the left. So it's cumulative carbon emissions. And generally speaking, since you've got, let me spell out the graph first, okay? So we've got a bunch of selected nations, and the little inner circle is referring to carbon emissions cumulative by that nation up until the year 1960, and then the larger circle around that represents the cumulative carbon emissions since 1960. So you can see places like the UK was early on, it was a civilized, I shouldn't say that word, that is a poor selection of language. It was a developed country in terms of industry very early on. Okay? The Industrial Revolution came to the UK pretty much before almost anywhere else. Germany is another place, right? So their inner circle is very close to their outer circle. France, okay? A number of nations in Europe are this way, where since 1960, they have not added a huge amount to their carbon emissions because they had developed already, essentially had all their industry put down in place by 1960, and most of the industry that's developed since then is more fuel efficient, burns less coal or natural gas and all these carbon-containing fossil fuels. The United States is sort of a middling kind of place where the inner dot, and there's still a fair bit of growth in the 50 years since 1960. But you can see, for instance, that there are big increases in places like India and Japan and China in particular since 1960 because their big boom in industrialization happened in this 50 years since 1960 to 2010. And this kind of shows you the outsized impact that the United States and other industrialized nations, Russia, et cetera, has had on spewing all of this carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, methane, these other greenhouse gases into Earth's atmosphere, and thus contributing to the climate change that we're seeing now that is affecting all of us. Now, it's worth saying that the United States is no longer the leader in carbon emissions. So if you were to look at the 2020 numbers, this circle would be actually a little bit less in diameter. Well, it's cumulative, so probably it'd still be bigger than China's. Okay, but in terms of like what happened last year, China is emitting more carbon dioxide than the United States. However, if you look at the cumulative numbers, the United States is far and away the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, and that is not just our problem, that's a problem of any industrialized nation, that we have this long history of carbon emissions that are our responsibility. I mean, admittedly, we didn't know what we were doing back in 1960. Right? The science of climate change was in its infancy back then. But the situation remains that we were and continue to be big carbon emitters and thus big drivers of the run-up in global temperatures, which causes all of the effects that we've discussed and read about for climate change. Now, it's also worth saying that successive rounds of global negotiations have produced the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which had negotiations that followed that, the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, and the Paris Agreement in 2015. And that is all very successful. That's all very encouraging that all of the nations, or very nearly all the nations in the world, could come together in these grand negotiations within the United Nations, recognize that climate change was this big problem that required a global solution, not just a piecemeal solution, and negotiated all of these protocols, treaties, agreements, whatever you would like to call them, that call on nations to have ambitious goals to cut their greenhouse gas emissions. However, when you're talking about international law, when you're asking a nation like China or Russia or the US or the UK or anybody else to do something, or else, sort of, it's the enforcement is always the thorny issue. And though there are mechanisms within the Kyoto Protocol for enforcement, and there are mechanisms within the Paris Agreement for enforcement and inspection and things like that, it's more than anything, more or less an honor system, because even if someone is found to be violating their targets in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, what then? And even the treaties with mechanisms that sort of, whether or not a nation has to pay financial penalties, is something that needs to be litigated through the United Nations. And then even if they were to be found guilty, quote unquote, if the nation refuses to pay up, then what happens? International law and the idea of national sovereignty are always a fraught issue. And the agreements rely essentially on everyone's self-preservation instincts to keep everybody in line. And that has been somewhat successful, but not as successful as one would hope. Here, focusing on the United States, though certainly other nations have their issues, the United States, because we have this huge impact on global climate because of our historical and current greenhouse gas emissions, we deserve particular attention. And we have the unusual circumstance. It's not that we're unique among nations in the world in this way, but we are pretty exceptional in that when you go back to, there he is, George H.W. Bush, 1992, he's the one that signed us into the treaty, and the Senate approved the treaty to form the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. Right? And he was a Republican. Right? Bill Clinton carried that on. He actually signed the Kyoto Protocol. He pushed for it, though eventually, when they came down to actually approving the thing in the early 2000s, George W. Bush was president. And by that point, the issue of climate change, global warming, climate disruption, whatever you'd like to call it, had become far more political than it ever was even just 10 years before in the era of George H.W. Bush. And it's unclear to me, and there's been a great deal written on the subject, like why in particular this has become an issue in the United States versus other nations which have generally had relatively consistent policies on climate change, even if they haven't always hit their goals. We go from George H.W. Bush to Bill Clinton, where everything seemed to be going in one particular direction, and we had time in terms of adjusting the output of our economy and the basis of our energy economy to address the effects of climate change before they became acute. By the time George W. Bush comes around, we did not ratify the treaty that went along with the Kyoto Protocol, and at that point, the Republican Party had firmly entrenched itself as a party that did not believe the experts, did not believe the science behind climate change, and did everything in their power to undermine it, and to undermine it in the minds of the set of voters that would vote for them in elections. Barack Obama went back the other direction. He's the one that signed us on to the Paris Agreement. It did not require ratification by the Senate because it was not a treaty, but unfortunately, because it's not a treaty, the Paris Agreement is easy to back out of, and Donald Trump did exactly that when he came into office. Now, technically, we're not out of it because there's a process that has to be gone through to back out of the agreement through the United Nations, but already the policies and rollbacks of regulations under the Trump administration has put us on a track to miss all of the targets that we agreed to in the Paris Agreement, the most modern negotiated global agreement on climate change and limiting of greenhouse gases. And this sort of oscillation from everything going in one direction to going back the other direction to going back the other direction to going back the other direction makes it very difficult not only for us to make any progress on mitigating the effects of climate change and reducing our greenhouse gas emissions in a timely and economically feasible way. It makes it so that when we go into negotiations with the whole globe, other nations do not feel that they can rely on the United States to set an example for other nations. And we really should be, because our cumulative carbon emissions are the largest of any nation on Earth. And that gives us a special responsibility, I believe. So we're getting into my opinion here, to take the lead in this arena. And just some polling data, and I'll let you digest it a little bit. Okay, it should be nice and clear on the video. But this has become a profoundly political issue. And there are some, little windows of encouraging data if you delve into some of the more specific polling data. But as you can see here, you're comparing conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats and all the shades of gray in between. It really hews to political party in terms of the belief that human activity contributes a lot to climate change, rather than anything else. And I think it's a real shame that an issue that should be more of a scientific debate and a policy debate, and something that global leaders and leaders in nations take very seriously, has been changed slowly, well, maybe not that slowly, over the course of a decade or two, into something that has a stark political divide, rather than a divide, for instance, between people who have read up on climate change and understand the science behind it, and people who have not, for instance, rather than it being a political thing. And I think that's unfortunate. And I hope that over successive administrations and successive decades, that this kind of divide in the political parties on this, what should be honestly a purely scientific issue, where science is informing good policy on this, maybe we can swing the pendulum back so that this is not a political issue like abortion and tax policy and all these other things that you hear about during elections, and puts it back in the realm of policymakers and scientists. But I can only hope at this point. So thanks for letting me ramble on a bit about this, and this wraps up our unit on climate change. Next, we're going to be moving on to quantum physics. Hope the sound came through okay.